All right, hey, go ahead, turn to Esther chapter 9. Um, if you missed last week, then, sorry. I don't know what to tell you. You missed last week. You can go back and watch it. So there are a couple things I really don't like about sports. One of them is that we applaud when someone does something wrong. It goes against everything that we've learned in life. We're like, you just did something bad, you got a penalty, you happen to be on the other team, you did something wrong, and I'm going to applaud you. It seems backwards to me. And I say that because this portion of Esther chapter 9 is the introduction of a festival. And on the surface, it is, we just made a festival because a bunch of people died. But that's not what it's all about. That's not what it's about at all. So you see people on TV, they're cheering. They're cheering because not because the other team did something bad, but because their team now has an advantage. And this portion of Esther, the festival that we're going to see, is because the bottom line is God keeps his promises. And so they institute this festival because they have an advantage, not because people just died on the 13th day of the month, but because they want to just recognize their advantage. And I think that's important for us to just sit and wrestle with for a little bit. That what is our advantage? And so our main idea for this morning is the faithfulness of God. That's what we're going to see. It's what we've seen all throughout the book of Esther. The faithfulness of God should ignite a celebration from God's people. That should be our response. It should always be our response. We see the faithfulness of God that should ignite a response. We'll go back to our wheel. And one of our wheels, one of our paths is respond in worship. Respond in a celebration of what God did and what God is doing and what God is going to do. And so that's what they're doing here. Let's go ahead and read it. Chapter 9, verse 18 says this, but the Jews who were at Susa assembled together on the 13th day as well as on the 14th day. And on the 15th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Thanksgiving. You need a picture in your mind. Therefore the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. It just became Christmas. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far who were in the provinces of King Xerxes, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast pur to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews, should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. So they called these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because all of the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year, according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim, and Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Xerxes with words of peace and truth to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their feasting and lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. So next week, we're going to talk about just the character and patience of Mordecai. That's the last 3 verses of Esther really have to deal with Mordecai. And I think it's important as we go forward as a church that we see what patience within God's hand looks like. So that's next week. And then the 3 weeks after that, we're going to talk about how do we measure our faith and some really good stories in the Bible about God giving opportunities to increase our faith. And I think the year 2022 is going to be a year of increased faith for our church. And so, but here we are at a festival. I find it interesting. The very last verse of Esther chapter 9 is, so the decree of Esther confirmed these matters. The queen. So let's just think about this for a minute before we even get into this. The queen just made a decision for the 127 provinces of the kingdom. Let that sink in. Queen Vashti, go back to chapter 1. Queen Vashti got kicked out. She was removed as queen because she tried to make her own decision. Just let that just sink in, the movement of God in these 9 chapters. What was, no, you can't, you're just the queen. You can't make your decision. My cabinet of 7 people will make sure that you never, ever can make your own decision. You're removed. You are done. You're over. We're going to spend the next bit of time getting a new queen. And over time, God putting the right people in the cabinet so Esther can make the right decision. It's the patient movement of God. The patient movement of God that is seen, the faithfulness of God has been seen throughout this book. And I think it's very fitting that at the end of it, it ignites a celebration. It ignites a celebration that is celebrated to this day. The Feast of Purim for the Jewish calendar is March 16 and 17 of next year. How nice of them to have a feast for our 25th anniversary. You know? But it is all these years have gone by and they still celebrate the faithfulness of God from something that happened years and years and years ago. You can write down Joshua 17:14. Because Joshua 17:14 is the verse where God says, if you destroy the Amalekites, I will protect you over and over and over again. And I will make sure the Jewish nation is never destroyed. That's kind of the context of Joshua 17. And this is the faithfulness of God. So jump forward before we get into the 3 steps of igniting a celebration response. I want to take you back to World War II just for a moment. Concentration camps. The destruction of the Jewish race. And as I was reading several different things this week, I learned that the Jews that were in concentration camps had the book of Esther written down, and they carried it with them all throughout their time in concentration camps, because it was their reminder, God will not destroy us. God will be faithful. God made a promise to us thousands of years ago that God will keep his promise. And there might be, you may just be sitting in this room, or you might be watching a video or a recording of this, and you just might need the reminder this morning that God keeps his promises. The things that God spoke into your life years and years and years ago, God keeps his promises. The faithfulness, you can drink a cup of coffee, or if you let that cup of coffee sit for a little while, what happens to the coffee? It gets cold. If you drink it like a good Baptist, it will never be empty. Your cup will be cold before it's empty. The faithfulness of God is never cold, and it's never empty. And you might need that reminder today. You might need that reminder. So let's look at these 3 steps. There are 3 steps in these verses to igniting a celebration response in our lives. And I have some application things at the end of here. Here's the first one. Verses 18 and 19 says this: the Jews who were at Susa assembled together on the 13th day, as well as the 14th day, and on the 15th of the month, they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Here's the first step. I don't know that any of us do this well. Rest and reflect in God's presence. The word rest comes straight from the word. Many of us have been sick, and we were forced to rest. Some of us don't do it as well as others. Some of us don't know how to just sit and get well. I found myself in a boat on Tuesday because somebody in this room doesn't know how to just sit. We're not going to point any fingers. But some of us, when we are physically healthy, know that we need to just sit and rest, and we don't know how to do it. We can't. We feel guilty if we just do nothing. But I want us to see that when we see the faithfulness of God in our lives, that should ignite a celebration response. And one of the ways that we celebrate God's goodness in our lives is we just sit and we rest and we reflect. And if rest wasn't in the verse, I would probably just say soak in God's presence. Get in the crock pot and stay there. This is not a microwave approach to life. This is slow cooker all the way. Just rest and reflect in God's presence because if we never ever get to, let me say that again. The way we get to celebrating is we just sit and we cherish. You go through old pictures and you wish, I wish I had one more day with grandma. And you sit and you remember the good old days and you remember the faithfulness and you remember that which you long to remember more. And you have to slow down long enough to do this. There have been times where I've talked about this and I have an orange tie. It is a bright orange tie. I got it from these guys at Hamburger University in 1996. They were from the Netherlands, so all of their McDonald's ties were orange because it was the Queen's favorite color. And so we traded. I didn't have orange McDonald's ties, and we traded. So I have this orange McDonald's tie. It has soccer all over it because it was the 1996 World Cup, and every now and then I'll just wear this orange tie as a reminder to people God speaks in the same volume all the time. Orange is always orange. Look at the chairs around you. Orange is always orange. It might become faint. It might need to be cleaned. It might just fade a little bit, but it's still orange. When we rest and we reflect, we can hear the constant volume level of God speaking into our lives. When we hear that, when we stop long enough to see God's activity and faithfulness, it ignites a celebration response. Maybe you've experienced it. Here's a second one. Here's the second. Rejoice. Rejoice in God's grace. Verses 20. He kind of recalls where they've been. Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews, near and far, who were in all the provinces of King Xerxes, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly. So I have words circled and highlighted. It's celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days of the Jews had rest. Celebrate, rest, all of the days on which the feast they had rested their enemies, on the day which he turned from sorrow to joy, from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and send presents to one another and gifts to the poor. And it goes on to, this is why. Rejoice in God's grace. So talk back to me just for, what does rejoice look like? In your own life, not necessarily, they're having a party. What does rejoice look like?
Like when we were super excited when my grandson was born.
Yeah?
It was a huge rejoicing.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, you can sing, you can dance. Sometimes rejoicing is it's just an internal emotion that makes you smile. But you're celebrating. You celebrated the birth of your grandchild. You celebrate different things in life. There is an automatic response. Rejoice and happiness are connected. So if you're probably not rejoicing at a funeral. Although you could be. It depends. But in most cases, you're not going to a funeral and like it's not a party. It's more of a somber, meditative, reflective. but you go to a basketball game or a wedding and you're rejoicing. I mean, unless you don't think the couple should get married. Like, in most cases, you're rejoicing. And wedding receptions are a celebration of what just happened most of the time. You go to a football game and you rejoice if your team wins. You're having a good time. There is emotion attached to that. And so here they are. They're rejoicing because their sorrow has become joyful. Their enemy had been defeated. The enemy laid out in Joshua 17 was finally defeated. They finally realized that the grace of God won. And so how I want us to think about how often do we not give God's grace credit for winning? Like, oh man, that was the medication. Mucinex for 8 days straight made me better. Maybe it was just God's grace that you didn't get sick worse. Yeah, but we as far as physical health goes, we rejoice in our ability to take medicine more often than we rejoice in our ability to trust God's grace that He's going to get us through it. And that's a tough pill to swallow, no pun intended. But we don't do this well. I would rather coast through life and trust my ability and celebrate what I can accomplish on my own versus taking the time to rest and reflect and rejoice in the fact that God just showed up. Because the American culture doesn't do this really well. We're trained to be the best you. You drive up to Tecumseh High School or the middle school or whatever, and you'll see the banner. You'll see the banner that says, "Be the best version of you today." That's what it says above the door. I don't always need God's grace in my life to be the best version of me. I can think that all day long. Well, quite frankly, without God's grace in my life, I'm a jerk. I mean, ask anyone that knows me well. I know it's hard to believe. It's hard to believe. Here's the third one. And I can't spell apparently. Verse 26 through 32. Remember that God keeps His promises. And so this is here they are. So they call these days Purim after the name Pur. You might remember back in chapter 3 when Haman cast Pur. That's the lot. It's throwing dice, shooting craps. This is the day we're going to make the decision. We're just going to roll the dice, play Yahtzee. The way it comes out is how it comes out. And they named this Purim for the purpose of casting lots was we're consulting the gods. And Purim is our God controls what you think your gods decide. Let me say that again. It might need to sink in all of us. Our God controls everything that you think your gods decide. And so they named this the Festival of Purim because it declares the sovereignty of God. It declares that the things that God said a long time ago, God is still in control of. And so they call these days Purim, and they wrote letters and they sent it out and they said, we want every generation, every family, every country, every Jew to remember that God keeps his promises, and we want you to remember it forever. And so the Jews in Auschwitz, this actually really tore me up. I struggled with this pretty significantly. That these Jews, this is not that long ago. This is fairly recent history in our lives where they literally walked around with the book of Esther on their person, and they would read the whole thing in one sitting every day to remind them that God keeps his promises. And there would be German soldiers that when they would see a Jew reading the book of Esther, they would take that Jew and they would execute him or her as an example to everyone else that, well, your God doesn't really keep his promises. You don't matter. And I read that and I dwell on them like, yay, God, because you proved that German soldier wrong. And in the hardships of life, when we think like everything is against us, God keeps his promises. When life looks really difficult, when life seems like it doesn't make any sense, when people are making decisions against us, when it seems like people might not value our opinion or what we think or even our values in life, God keeps his promises. So they celebrate this festival. They instituted this festival that will take place on March 16th, 2022, so they can pause. They have one day out of the year, every year, that they remember God keeps his promises. Which is also very interesting to me because the Jews missed half of God's promises. And they're still waiting for God's promises, but they're waiting. And they're remembering and they're hoping and they're resting and they're reflecting and they're rejoicing that something God said in Joshua 17, God did much, much later in life, and it was hard. And in recent history, people still tried to destroy the Jews, and God kept his promise. And if you spend time in the Middle East in 2021 or 2022, you will still see that people are still trying to destroy the Jews. God keeps his promises. So the application for this, I wrote a couple things down, but I have a couple things in my head as well. The first one is, what are the areas in your life where you just need to rest? You need to grow. Maybe you need to grow in this area where you need to just get better at resting and reflecting in God's presence, soaking time. What do you need to grow in your ability to just get in the Jesus crock pot and just stay there? the longer chili sits in a crock pot, the better it tastes. And God has that same principle for us. Maybe you don't know how to rejoice. Maybe you don't know how to rejoice spiritually. We're going to learn in the next year how to respond and worship well. Because I want to suggest to you, that there is a huge difference between singing songs. Sometimes, not all the time. Don't send me emails and all that. Like, you're off your rocker. There are differences between just singing songs sometimes and worshiping God. I can sing words on a page and mean nothing, and they don't go anywhere. And I can also, this is not about a style of music, this is about a posture of heart. And so I pray every day that people will walk into this building and they will feel the presence of God so deeply that if they're not here, they know they missed something. The Shania glory of God that filled the tabernacle in the Old Testament, I pray that when people walk in this place, they will feel that glory of God, and it will be like, I have to be there. And we have to learn how to rejoice in God's grace collectively in order to make that happen. Maybe you're that person. You're just like, I just need to be reminded that God keeps his promises. Maybe you are, parenting is really tough. Anyone agree? Yeah. Here's what I've learned by talking to older people than me. Grandparenting is tougher. Because you see the choices that your kids are making for your grandchildren, and you want to fix it, but you can't. And as tough as parenting is, grandparenting in some ways is easier, but some ways it's tougher. And we just need to remember that when we speak God's promises into people younger than us, and we pray those promises, and we faithfully pray the faithfulness of God into another person, that God keeps his promises over time. Never immediate. So here are the three things that I wrote down. Those are all, none of those, that's for somebody in this room. Here's the first thing that I wrote, and I was sitting just dwelling on my piece of paper, and I wrote these things. God, would you help me to passionately pursue Jesus more often? Because I don't always do these things well. And the second thing I wrote was, God, would you help that passion to spill into those around me that need Jesus? Because it doesn't take long in a conversation with me to figure out what I'm passionate about. It just doesn't take long. But it's really easy for me to talk about some things. It takes a long time for me to start a conversation about Jesus in a coffee shop or wherever. And for me, that's a gut check of how passionately am I pursuing God keeping his promises. For me, that's a gut check of how passionate am I about rejoicing in God's grace and resting well and celebrating that which God is going to do in our future. And so as much as I need those things, you guys need those things as well. The last thing that I wrote was, God, would you help us celebrate Jesus better as a church? And that looks, there is not a one size fits all on celebrating Jesus, but I want to make sure in the next year that we celebrate Jesus. Because I want every person that walks in those doors to be hit with the presence of God like a tsunami. And we have to learn how to celebrate in order for that to happen. So next week, we'll finish up Esther next week and talk about the patience required over time to see God keep his promises.